So just for my edification on this, how many of you would call yourself a developer? Raise your hand. How many people would have other people call them a manager? I'm sorry. How about folks in UX? 0. Okay. QA? 1. You're at least willing to admit to it. Thank you. How about product owners? 1. Okay. Scrum masters? A couple scattered around. Well, we're hopefully going to make this interesting for everybody. So let's get started. So today we're going to talk about resolving conflict with collaboration. This is me. Hi, I'm Art, or Arthur, take your pick. I don't really care. I'm a software engineer, have been for now a depressingly long amount of time, 20 years at this point, which means I'm going to just crumble into dust before your very eyes. But it's important to note that I am not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a therapist. I am not a licensed anything, really. But I do love brains. I am a self-taught hobbyist when it comes to brains because I love them, not in like a weird zombie way, but I love taking what we've learned about these things, the things in organizational and cognitive psychology, and applying that to work, to our software jobs, to figuring out how we can be better developers, to figuring out how we can be better coworkers, to figuring out how we can be better people. I work for this company, which you've never heard of, but they are a small software consultancy in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I am from in the United States. And they let me come and do cool things like give talks, so they get a slide. Let's start with everybody's favorite, a quiz. Go ahead and raise your hand if you think you've been in a conflict with a coworker in the past. I should see every hand go up. But first, we really do have to distinguish between conflict and disagreement. So a disagreement is 2 or more people who hold differing or opposing opinions or beliefs about something at work, or at least that's a workplace-related disagreement. A disagreement becomes a conflict when 3 things are true. And the first of those things is it's important. You think this thing matters. The second is when you are interdependent with each other. You are on the same team. You succeed together, you fail together. And the third is when you both believe that the weight of the evidence is on your side, what they call evidentiary skew, which is just a fun word to say. So with that definition in place, how many of you have ever been in conflict with a coworker? Okay. How many of you enjoyed that experience? There's always some weirdos. But largely, we don't enjoy conflict because most of the conflict that we recognize as conflict sucks. As a result, we're usually afraid of it. And we do this technique called defensive avoidance. We downplay, sidestep, ignore, or explicitly just avoid as much as possible conflict wherever we can manage it. Which is a problem for developers because conflict is everywhere for us. It's going to happen. If you put 4 engineers in a room, you're going to have 9 opinions and probably 12 by the end of the day. So we'd better be prepared for conflict because believe it or not, conflict can be beneficial. And I would argue it is in fact essential for you to succeed at your jobs. Now, luckily, humans have been in conflict with each other for a very long time. I went to the British Museum once and they have a mummy of a person who's like 10,000 years old who's just been stabbed in the back by a sword. So at least that long we have been in conflict with each other. Nowadays we do it a lot less with swords, but certainly in a workplace environment, I hope. But psychology has done a ton of research for us on conflict. So let's dig into it today. We're going to talk about the 3 kinds of conflict: task conflict, process conflict, and relationship conflict. We're then going to talk about psychological safety as a groundwork for good conflict. We're going to talk about how to deal with your emotions during conflict. Please don't leave. I promise it will still be interesting. We're going to talk about confrontational styles. And lastly, we're going to talk about how to deal with conflict when you're just an individual contributor, not a manager, not a leader. Let's start with the 3 kinds of conflict because it's helpful to think of conflict in terms of where it originates from. It can come from disagreements about performing the tasks at hand, about what we do. What framework are we using? What language are we using? What are the techniques? What are the patterns? What are the processes that we follow in terms of the software piece? And task conflict, which when you explain it, sounds pretty normal. It's beneficial to us. Task conflict can help us at work. It can help us find new ideas, solve problems in new ways, identify entirely different ways to deliver value. It can also help us locate risks in our proposed solutions. And then there's process conflict. Process conflict is conflict that comes from disagreements about the process, about how we do that work. Who's in charge? What are the goals of what we're doing? How does the team even decide any of those things? How do we make decisions? Process conflict can help us define new ways of working. Things like XP or Agile wouldn't exist as methodologies if people hadn't been in conflict with each other about how to deliver software. It can help solidify our own team goals and outcomes, help us figure out what we're even trying to do here. And it can help us actually figure out if we have the right people on the team. If we start having conflicts about things because we have a lack of information, maybe we need someone that's a better resource about these things. But after your team has started and you've begun the work, process conflict can rapidly turn toxic. After a certain point, if you're experiencing process conflict, what that means is that you have some inequity on your team. Someone has a perceived inequity, thinks that things aren't fair, or there's some allocation of resources that they don't necessarily agree with. That's what is indicative if you have continued process conflict, someone continuing to say, I don't like the way we do things. I don't think this is right. And process conflict isn't just about individuals either. It can be driven by systemic factors. If you have processes and methodologies forced upon you by where you work or who you work with, that can affect your team. That can induce conflict in your team if the individuals aren't necessarily agreeing with it. It can also be driven by role-based reasons. If you have people on your team and there's not really a clarity over the boundaries of their roles and they both think something is their problem, that's a recipe for conflict. Lastly, there's relationship conflict. And relationship conflict is conflict that comes from disagreements about who we do the work with. It's caused by personal dislike, by distaste. It can be caused by power-seeking behaviors, any number of things. And this is the kind of conflict that we hate, that we're afraid of, that we seek to avoid at all possible costs. That's awful and it's squamous and it's dangerous and it doesn't help anything. Relationship conflict starts bad and it just gets worse. Conflict doesn't really just arise inside our teams either. It can happen between teams. In fact, any of these conflict types can happen between teams, which is a problem because I don't know, maybe you're lucky enough to work someplace where you have like 5 developers and you all know each other. Most software these days is developed by large companies, certainly large enough to have multiple teams of individuals, all working to achieve the goal of the company, or, several companies if you're a contractor. The days in which we could build things in our dorm rooms that change the world are kind of over, unfortunately. Well, for better or for worse. And so we have to work with these other teams that have other people, have other methodologies, have other processes. They've made conflicts themselves and answered them in particular ways that may not sync up with how you've solved various conflicts. So how do we maximize good conflict, if conflict is good, and minimize the bad conflict? Well, like any good magic trick, most of the work happens way before the actual event. If you want to have good conflict in your teams and minimize that bad conflict, you need to start long before you start having conflicts. So we need to talk about psychological safety. How many people have heard of this before? Good. That's way more than at the last conference I was just at, which is heartening. Because human beings are social animals. That's not a stretch, right? I mean, arguably, we are the most social animal. And we evolved actually to think of our social relationships as synonymous with, if not more important than our own safety. And arguably it was, if you think about it in terms of the environment in which we involved small groups of individuals, being ostracized was effectively a death sentence. So we actually have a physical sense almost of how strong those relationships with other human beings are and in which direction they swing. And it's largely unconscious. This isn't something you necessarily are like carrying around in your head. I mean, unless you're very dedicated to maintaining your relationships, in which case, kudos, good job. But part of the reason that we are risk averse when it comes to conflict is that we want to avoid damage to those relationships. Because again, we value them almost more importantly than our own personal safety. And we do this unconsciously without thinking about it. Because it's that important to our survival, or at least it was, and arguably still is. Improperly managed conflict can be really damaging. Can lead to an immense amount of stress, can lead to you not having a job anymore if it goes really sideways. Psychological safety is a description of environment where people feel safe enough to take interpersonal risks, to risk those relationships that they are unconsciously protecting by speaking up and sharing concerns, questions, or ideas with each other, especially with people who have power over them. Amy Edmondson, who's done a ton of research on psychological safety, describes psychological safety as a climate. It is an environment in a team. It is not a criteria, a thing you can hit via checklists. And as we'll talk about a little bit more later, it's not something you can achieve at an organizational level, not easily. And psychological safety isn't just about being nice either, because toxic positivity is arguably just as bad as toxic negativity. And it isn't just a personality factor, which is to say that you can't be psychologically safe on a team, then go to another team and also be psychologically safe there just because you're you. It's not something you carry around with you. It's not an attribute of you. It's something about that environment that you're in. And it isn't simply trust either. I like to think of it as you give trust and you receive psychological safety in return. It's almost a transactional engagement with your team. So why do you want psychological safety? Well, without psychological safety, people tend to hold back, even if they believe that what they say is, or have to say, could be beneficial, not just for the company, not just for their team. Sometimes they hold back, even if it could be beneficial to themselves, because it would damage those relationships. And again, they do this largely unconsciously, or if it is conscious, it's happening decision-wise long before they're really thinking about it. And then they're just kind of post facto assigning a reason behind it. Teams with psychological safety help prevent catastrophic failures. Amy Edmondson's original research into psychological safety was about hospitals, about teams of doctors and nurses working together and measuring failures, because that was her original research, was about failure. And she started noticing that teams that worked together more, that talked together more, that communicated more, had more failures, had made more mistakes, which did not add up. And so she pivoted her research and started looking at this. And what happens is it's those teams admit their errors and mistakes. It's not that the other ones aren't making them. It's that those teams who have psychological safety are willing to say, we screwed up and we should do better. Psychological safety also helps teams have higher performance and higher engagement, if those are magic words to you. Like if those are things you care about, this is one of the ways you can concretely get more engagement on a team. And it doesn't even involve like a pizza party. Most importantly, psychological safety allows us to find hidden conflict on our teams and to surface it. Because if you think that your team doesn't have conflict, I'm here to tell you, and I hate to be the one to tell you, that you are wrong. That there is conflict on your teams. It's there. Lurking beneath the surface, already driving people's actions. And psychological safety can help you pull that to the surface and discuss it, to realize that it's there and to engage with it constructively. So, okay, great. If I've made the case, how do we get this? Well, like I said earlier, you can't really do this at an organizational level. Again, Edmondson describes this like a climate. Think about something like, say, the California coast, where you can go over a mountain range and suddenly you're into this tiny valley that has its own weird microclimate, micro-ecosystem. That's what psychological safety is like. You can go from team to team in an organization and find it, not find it, find it, not find it, and for different reasons and in different amounts. It has to be established at an interpersonal level, with a team, with a working group. It's about those interpersonal relations. It's about knowing that you aren't going to damage them. All you can do is prepare the overall environment of your organization, of your team, so that psychological safety emerges. It's like gardening. You have to till the soil, fertilize, mix in the right amounts of peat moss, whatever else, depending on what your soil needs, earthworms, etc., making sure you have a decent water supply. And then, like magic, all of that also has to be prepared long before it's needed. If you're interested in getting it, I actually do recommend Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization. If I've sold you on psychological safety already, then you can skip the first half of the book. If I haven't, please read the first half of the book, because she does a way better job of getting you interested in it than I ever could in the amount of time I have. And also, it's her life. Like, that's her research. So she's really good at selling it. But in the latter part of the book, she introduces the leader's toolkit for building psychological safety in an organization. This is it. Thankfully, we are not going to go through each of these in turn. That's a lot to go through. But we are going to talk about a couple of these because I think they matter a lot. We're going to talk about demonstrating situational humility, practicing inquiry, and expressing appreciation. So first, we're going to talk about demonstrating situational humility. Nobody wants to participate. Nobody wants to tell you things if you already seem like you know everything or pretend that you know everything. You have to adopt a learning mindset, a humble mindset. Situational humility, which is to say the need for humility lives in the situation. You have to acknowledge your own errors, your shortcomings, the things you don't know. And that can be hard because organizationally, some cultures, some company cultures resist this. Sometimes very vigorously. But you have to fight back. You have to turn around and err on the side of I don't know instead of an uninformed opinion. Edmondson says power can cause leaders to become obsessed, overly obsessed with control or with outcomes. And one of those things can be focusing on getting problems to go away, getting people to go away. To dig a little deeper into situational humility, we have to talk about this thing called naive realism. And naive realism is a psychological concept that I think is demonstrated best by another simple question. So we're going to do this as an exercise. I would like you to raise your hand and keep it up if you think a hot dog is a sandwich. Okay, keep your hand up. Everybody look around the room. Everybody who said it's a sandwich has to go on that side. Everybody who said it isn't is on that side, and then we're going to fight. That's the rest of this talk. No. It's a very simple question, right? Like, is a hot dog a sandwich? It's even kind of funny. It's banal, right? But there are people in this very room who disagree with your opinion on it. And in fact, you probably have a very strong belief behind your answer in whether it's a hot dog or whether it's a sandwich or not. I have seen people argue for literal hours about this. But there are people in this very room who don't agree with you and probably have just as strong a belief. Why? Well, because humans are different, brains are different, people are different. But naive realism is this thing that brains do that makes us believe that the way we see the world, the way we perceive the world, is the way the world is. And when we believe that, we tend to believe that anybody who doesn't share our opinions is wrong, which isn't necessarily true. Because as you see, humans, when we live our lives, as we go through the world from birth, we start gathering samples through our senses. We see things, we hear things, we feel things, we learn words, we talk to people, we make relationships. Those samples shape our autonomous unconscious selves. those autonomous selves actually shape our expectations of the world. And what that does is our expectations shape how we collect further samples. This is confirmation bias, where we move through the world expecting things to be as they have been for us. And in a very literal sense, they are that way for us. We see more of that because we're primed for it, because that's how our brain has literally been built, how the synapses have wired. Over time, we as humans diverge from each other and we specialize. We see different things, we notice different things, and that's great. Because I don't know about you, but I do not have enough time in the day to be a good security engineer, a site reliability engineer, doing front-end CSS and JavaScript and whatever backend you've picked, plus any microservices stuff and the database. We also have to put it in all of the IAC. Like, I can't, and that's just work. Then I have to go home and manage like everything there. I need like 8 of me for that. Probably I need a full company of me for that. We specialize as human beings. We see different things. We care about different things, and that's awesome. If I've not sold you on this, I have definitive proof that your expectations shape your reality in a very visceral sense. How many people remember this? Yep. 2015, the last good day on the internet, right before everything went to crap. There was this dress, and then later in the day, there were like these llamas that escaped in Texas, and there were these videos of the sheriffs trying to chase and corral these llamas. It was great. This went across like wildfire, right? Everybody was like, it's a black and blue dress, it's a white and gold dress, and it was literally like, I feel like there were literally divorces because of this. People just like, it's white and gold. No, it's black and blue. And, proceed to screaming. Like, people really felt violently intense about the outcome of this. Now, we do know the real color of the dress. It was black and blue. So congratulations if that was you, but you feel vindicated. Here's the thing. You don't see the world. Your eyes do not perceive the world, or certainly your brain does not. When you perceive a color, we've been told that it is about the wavelength of light hitting your retinas that transmits electrical patterns into your visual cortex. Well, your visual cortex is a squirrely place, and it does some weird stuff. And the funny thing is if you dig into this, I feel like there were actually PhDs minted off of this. Night owls, if you are a night owl, somebody who tends to stay up past midnight, there's an official definition of when your median bedtime actually is. You tended to see the dress as black and blue because your expectation, your priors, told you that you were seeing it in artificial light. If you are a morning lark, somebody who tends to get up and experience a lot of natural light in the daytime, you saw the dress as white and gold. You tended to. Our expectations shaped how we saw the dress. I've been speaking since 2016. That's the first time that's happened. I appreciate it. It was actually a really great moment for it too. But that's the point. You can see how the sunlight is hitting it and it looks white and gold. And how when it's in shade, it looks black and blue. Your expectations literally shaped how you saw this. They've actually replicated this. That's the really bonkers part. They took a photo of all things, somebody wearing socks in Crocs, those rubber shoes. And then they sucked, they altered the photo so that the colors are warped slightly, and your expectation of what color socks should be affects your what you see the Crocs as. So if you are a person who wears white socks religiously, then you tended to see the Crocs as greenish. Otherwise, they look pinkish, depending on whatever color you're seeing the socks as. You don't see the real world. You see a construction of it through your brain. I'm in the middle of Will Storr's Science of Story, and he literally describes it as an ongoing hallucination that your brain does to you all the time. I think that's a perfect description. So you have to practice inquiry. Other people are seeing different things from you because other people are different people from you. Naive realism makes us think that we know what's going on, and we fail to be curious. Asking questions in a lot of places is often seen as weak as well. Some cultures have a culture of telling. And when we're asking questions, they can broaden understanding. They could be things like, well, what else is true? Or they could deepen understanding. A question like, why do you think so? Why is that true? Edmondson provides some rules for a good question. First is you start by not knowing the answer. If your boss comes up to you and says, hey, when you implemented that thing, you used the observer pattern, right? Everybody in the room knows the answer to that question, which is yes, I absolutely did. Because the answer to that question is in the question itself. So you don't want to do that. You also don't want to ask questions that limit responses to yes or no. Because if you really want to understand what that person is saying, you need something more than just a yes or a no. And again, because if they don't have psychological safety yet, they're going to try and find out in their head, what do they think your opinion is, and go with that. So you need to dig into it further. You need to phrase the question in a way that helps them share their thinking in a focused way. So for instance, okay, when you were implementing this ticket, can I ask what kind of pattern were you following? Any at all? That sounds a little bit attack. Like, it's hard. You have to practice this, but you can engage with this intentionally, these questions, and get better at it. And use elaboration questions. Things like, I'm curious why you believe that. And when people have asked questions of you or brought things up to you, you have to express appreciation to keep that culture of inquiry alive, because it can't just be you asking questions. Everybody's got to learn to do it. You have to express appreciation for that question. It's simple, actually, because think about it. If you are somebody in power, it takes some guts for somebody else to bring something up to you as a problem. So appreciate the risk that they took. Thank you. I'm really glad you asked that. You want to praise for their effort and not for their outcome in terms of the questions. And then you can turn around and say, all right, well, you didn't actually understand that I have a larger context that you're not seeing, and provide that. You might ask, can you get psychological safety in an environment where just a team, if the rest of the environment is completely chaotic? Like if you work at a dumpster fire, can a team be individually psychologically safe? And the answer is yes, but it takes some effort. And over a long term, it is going to burn out the manager who is shielding your team, or whoever is shielding your team, from the surrounding nonsense going on. But psychological safety isn't enough in and of itself. We're human, so our emotions, unfortunately, often get in the way, and we have to talk about how to deal with those. Largely, it seems intuitive that controlling emotions in an environment of conflict would lead to better results, right? Nope. I mean, it'd be funny if it was just like, yes, and talk over. No, obviously it's not. Stuffing emotions into a bag doesn't make them go away. I wish the world looked like Severance, that TV show on Apple, but it doesn't. It would be a hell of a lot easier if it did. A lot of developers are just not taught, for whatever reason, the skills to cope with their emotions. And so when they stuff them into a bag, they just get more angry. So what do you do about that? Well, you could read this book. I don't recommend it. I mean, if you're really into psychology, I really recommend it. It is 260 pages and it is dense as hell. But it is packed with really cool information. Like, how many of you have heard of double loop learning? No? That's really, okay, now you should go read this book. It's packed with information, but it took me months to get through. Argus and Schoen lay out two models for conflict, for interaction in conflict, Model 1 and Model 2. Now, Model 1 seeks to win in a zero-sum game, and they seek to control the emotions of the other participants, because when they say win, they are trying to win and prevent the other side from winning. And so they seek to control the entire playing field, including all of the players on it. And they want to enact concrete strategies to achieve those outcomes, to set out a plan before they even engage in conflict. Model 1 leads to two things: self-fulfilling prophecies, which a lot of people have heard of, but also self-sealing processes, which most people have not. If you've not heard of a self-fulfilling prophecy, we're going to go through one of those. I'd like you to meet Sawyer and Morgan. Sawyer's a student in Morgan's class. And Morgan has been told and believes that Sawyer is a troublemaker, so they're going to keep an extra sharp eye out rather, for Sawyer stepping out of line. Sawyer, on the other hand, is going to feel unfairly singled out because they are. And as a result, they're going to get angry at Morgan. Sawyer is going to act out in an attempt to display their defiance and their lack of respect. That's going to reinforce Morgan's opinion. And they're now locked in this vicious circle of belief, expectation, and behavior. That is a self-fulfilling prophecy, something where you believe something is true, and that causes it to come into being. A self-sealing process, on the other hand, is different and somewhat more pernicious. So to walk through that, we're going to look at Jordan and Taylor. Jordan is Taylor's manager, and they also hold Model 1 as their model of conflict action, their theory of action. Jordan thinks Taylor's incompetent at coding, but also believes that they can't confront Taylor about it because Taylor's going to get upset about that feedback, understandably. And then remember, if you're in Model 1, you're seeking to control other people's emotions. So you don't want to necessarily prompt that kind of emotional response. So Jordan doesn't have the conversation. Instead, they enact a plan where they turn around and try to get Taylor to transition to being a QA by assigning Taylor all of these QA-related tasks and then praising the performance on them. Taylor, on the other hand, who is not an idiot, has doubts about the authenticity of Jordan's praise about these QA efforts. But they don't confront Jordan about it because they don't have psychological safety. And they can't bring this up to their boss because that would ensue a conflict. And there's a risk when you get into conflict with your boss. Taylor's angry about what they see as Jordan's deception, and they refuse to transition to QA. At this point, Jordan is now locked in a prison of their own making. As long as they believe that they have to prevent Taylor from getting mad, they have no way of confronting Taylor about their performance. They can't. All they can do is continue to make these useless hints that have already locked both of them into this pattern of behavior. On the other hand, Model 2 seeks to arrive at a win-win scenario to achieve the goals for all parties involved in the conflict, to accept and to understand the emotions of all the other participants, and to avoid at all costs those self-sealing processes, because those lock you into places where you don't have any viable options. The problem becomes, if you're afraid of conflict, if you're afraid of emotions, if you're afraid of losing, which is reasonable and arguably human, you unconsciously gravitate toward Model 1. Worse yet, when you try to control people's emotions, they end up more emotional, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we're confronted with these ideas, with the opinions that don't agree with us and these emotions, we either angrily swat down these opinions that people have as incorrect, or we turn around and we use moral language to batter our opponents down. How could you think that? You must be an idiot. So what do we do about that? That sounds like fun, right? Well, we provide psychological safety and we prepare to get uncomfortable. That's what. We drag emotions out into the open at our work by doing things like offering explicit points to talk about them. We have these wonderful moments in time when we look back at things we've done, retrospectives. That's a perfect place for emotions. How do you feel about the work we've done this sprint? Are you proud of it? Or postmortems, where you're looking back at failures. How did you feel about the circumstances before that? What about after? If you're a leader, you can model that emotional talk. Say things like, I don't understand how this system works and that scares me. It makes me afraid that we're going to be held responsible for something that we have no control over. Therapy can be a good sort of preventative maintenance and can get you used to talking about your feelings or to get comfortable with your own emotions. It doesn't have to be this huge thing. You can just go for a couple sessions and learn how this works. But conflict has this weird thing. When it's left over time, even good conflict like task conflict starts to amp up in emotional intensity if it's not managed, if it's not dealt with. If someone is getting antsy about feedback on their idea, they may not be emotionally separate from the idea yet. And when either of those things are true, task conflict can become relationship conflict. Disagreements can fester over time. Valid, concrete disagreements become things that where two people are now irrevocably locked into as nemesis at each other at work. And they think each of their other, they're both big jerks. So how do we lock that in? How do we keep conflict localized to just the pieces of conflict that we're talking about? Well, Julia Minson, who's a psychologist, has a technique called conversational receptiveness. Because it turns out that no matter how humble you want to be, no matter how empathetic you want to be in a conversation, most of the time that's not externally visible to the other participant. So even if it's having an effect on you, it doesn't have an effect on them. So she recommends a technique called HERE, which is an acronym. The first stage is hedging. When you're stating your opinions, you want to use hedging words, those weasel words that they tell you not to use in school. Things like sometimes, perhaps, maybe. The next step is you want to emphasize agreement. Find the things you do agree about. The points that you do hold in common. Generally, as developers, we want the build to run. If you don't, I would like to have a conversation with you because I'm sure that's fascinating. But right, we have things in common with each other, and we can find them, and we want to emphasize that agreement to show each other that we're on the same page. Then we want to run acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is where you restate the idea back at them, the thing they said back at them in your own language, to show them that you understood it. And lastly, you want to try to reframe to the positive. Instead of saying things like, I really hate it when people interrupt me, reframe it. Say, I really love it when people let me finish my sentences. Which sounds a little like weird and Mr. Rogers-y, right? But you know what? I'm okay with sounding like Mr. Rogers. But unfortunately, we don't just bring emotions to the table in conflict. We bring the whole big hot mess of ourselves as humans. Our tendencies, whether those are innate or learned, mean that we tend to approach conflict in specific ways. So let's talk about confrontational styles. There are 5 of these. They fit in a diagram like this. This is what's called the dual concern model of conflict styles, where on the one axis is concern for others' outcomes, and on the other is concern for your outcome. So let's go through each of these in turn. The first we're going to talk about is avoiding, which is a strictly passive approach. Avoiders hope that problems solve themselves. And they turn around and rather than discuss conflict, they change the subject, they skip meetings, sometimes they even leave the group or the team entirely. This is defensive avoidance. Don't want to engage. I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to engage with conflict. It's all terrible. There's yielding, which is a passive pro-social approach. Yielders tend to try and solve small and large conflicts by just giving in to other people's demands. Now, that could be because of either genuine conversion or it could just be superficial compliance. They don't care enough to argue about it. There's fighting, which is the active pro-self approach. Fighters use competitive, powerful tactics to intimidate. They use mandates, challenges, arguing, insults, accusing, complaining, vengeance, even physical violence. This is model 1, where you're engaging, you're trying to win and prevent the other person from winning. Cooperating is the active pro-social and pro-self approach. The goal here is to achieve both things, to identify the issues underlying that dispute, and to work to identify a solution for both of them. And it tries to get everyone involved in the conflict to consider each person's outcomes. The last style is conciliating, which is a mixed approach. And conciliating is where you attempt to win over on some things, but you yield on other things. Now, there are some psychologists that think this doesn't actually exist. They think it's just people switching strategies in the middle of a particular disagreement. Because the reality is that you don't just have one of these. You have a preferred one for sure, but you have all of these confrontational styles at your disposal, and you will use them depending on things like what are the norms of the group you're interacting with? Where's your social standing in that group? It helps to know the confrontational styles of your coworkers as well. Keep an eye out for what they tend to use and what that implies about their goals. Speaking of goals, you and your team do have a shared goal. hopefully you all care about making software that works, that does what it's supposed to do, that is clean, that is well tested, that is well architected. Now, you can argue about what any of those mean, but you all do want those things. At least I hope so. So all of this is good if you're a manager or CEO, a team leader, whatever. What can you do if you're just a lowly developer, if you're just a person that works and you don't have any power? So let's talk about handling conflict as an individual contributor. The first thing I want you to do is not to sell yourself short. You would be surprised what a single individual can do to the behavioral norms of a group. Repeated insistence on an opinion or on the need for something to change can shift an entire group over time, as long as you keep at it, not obnoxiously. In fact, the key is to remain a member in good standing of the group. If you become an outsider to the group, if you raise enough of an objection that you now put yourself outside of the group, it is that what everyone on that team is going to do is instantly ignore you. So you have to remain a member in good standing. This is important. You want to find those shared goals and reiterate that you believe in those shared goals of the team. You also have to be aware of power dynamics if you're just an individual. Power can make you look at people with less problems or with less power as problems to be solved. If you have your typical manager's workload or your typical tech lead's workload or anybody who's tended to be senior in a company, if somebody comes to you with a problem, with a concern, with a question, it is extremely tempting to just shut them up and get them off of your to-do list. That's what power can start doing to you. Lack of power can change the conflicts you can shift in any meaningful way. Some things you just can't tractably solve. Additionally, if you have power, when somebody challenges you, when somebody engages in conflict with you, you can feel like that threatens your status. Your monkey brain kind of just like comes online and is like, no, now I have to hit you with a bone. Like, one of the reasons why sometimes it's a risk challenging your boss in public if they've not established that culture of psychological safety. And if you see a team where individuals are engaging in conflict with their manager, with somebody who has power over them on a regular basis, that is absolutely a team that has psychological safety. Assuming they're all doing it. Otherwise, that might just be one jerk. I don't know. Try to engage with Model 2 as much as you can. Start conflicts with Model 2, and sometimes people will mirror that back at you. And sometimes they won't. You have to know when somebody's engaging with you in a Model 1 mindset, because at that point, Model 2 is not really going to work. Again, if you have power, that makes it more likely. In that moment, you have to decide if the conflict is worth it. Are you going to try to switch to Model 1 to engage with them? Or are you going to nope out of it? Because it's just not worth the conflict. It also helps to know the difference between goals and positions. Goals are the things in a conflict that somebody ultimately wants to achieve, the reasons they're getting into conflict in the first place. The positions are how they have envisioned achieving that goal. So for instance, if somebody on your team thinks that the best way to have really good, clean code is to do everything in Go, which I'm assuming if there was a Rust talk right before this, so I'm assuming everybody's really into Rust. I don't know. Or if you're not, maybe the other person thinks they really should do things in Rust, and now you have a big disagreement. But you both still think that the goal is to deliver good working software. It's just a disagreement about how to get there. You can rarely shift someone's goal, but you can almost always shift their position so that it overlaps with yours too. Or you can just find a goal that you do share and work through the conflict that way. People with differing amounts of power in the organization almost certainly have differing goals. Not only are they going to have a bunch of status-based goals, they're going to have organizational level goals, things driven by, say, PKIs, et cetera, broader corporate organizational things that you don't necessarily have visibility into. If you cannot pick your style of conflict, you have to pick your conflicts carefully. What things really matter to you? Which ones are worth it? You also have to think about your demographics and what that means in conflict. Because sometimes additional, if your demographics are specific and different from the rest of your team, that can mean you have less organizational power. It means you have less ability to shift things in conflicts. You can also pull in other team members if you engage in conflict. Pull the rest of the team in, especially if you know they're going to agree with you. That's great, right? I mean, it'll work. Don't get me wrong. This is a great way to shut down conflict. But it is a power play, and the other person will absolutely know that it is a power play, and they'll remember that. It's not a great way to build a relationship with someone else. The easiest way to get around that is to do something like set up a team charter when you form your team, or at some point where there's a natural break point, and say, how do we have discussions? How do we have disagreements? Maybe we take 5 minutes and we discuss something one-on-one, and if it takes longer than 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and we can't come to any kind of agreement, we bring in the whole team. That is a way to do this strategy without pissing anybody else off. I mean, they might piss them off, but typically the purpose of a team charter is you can slip it in front of them and go, you said this was cool back in the day. And that will often help cool somebody down. How many people have ever read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? If you enjoyed the book, I'm sorry, because I hated it. So everybody else in the room, please don't read it. But I loved this habit. This is one of them. This is the best thing I got out of that book. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. Your goal in conflict is this. Start with trying to understand what the other person is even doing, what their goal is, what their position is. Be curious. Explore their reasoning and motivations. Don't think of them as an opponent. Think of them as a collaborator. Especially if you can find that shared goal with them. You're trying to collaborate to get to that goal. So, all right. If you're ready to come out fighting, let's do a review. There's more than one kind of conflict, and they're not all bad. We've got task conflict that comes from the work we do. We have process conflict that comes from how we do that work, and relationship conflict that comes from who we do that work with. Psychological safety enables us to find and surface hidden conflict that's already there in our teams, already shaping that behavior. Emotions are going to happen in conflict, and you cannot stop them, at least until the brain implants happen. Trying to control those emotions using Model 1 methods creates self-sealing processes that lock us in to situations where we can't change anything, but we hate where we're at. You as a leader can offer explicit moments to model emotions and to offer them for your team to talk about. If you recognize the confrontational style of the other participants, that can help you engage, adjust, or withdraw, depending on what you need. As an individual, you can be aware of power dynamics. Find those overlap in the goals or positions that fulfill all or most of the goals in the conflict. And you can pick your conflicts carefully. Conflict doesn't have to be a Lord of the Flies situation, folks. It's a part of being human. It arises naturally from the fact that we all specialize from the moment of birth to become different people, which I think is, again, great. It makes the world interesting. And conflict can lead us to a better place, a place where we work better together, where we feel valued, where we create things that we can be proud of together. I want to thank you very much for listening. I will be up here, or you can catch me at the rest of the day for the conference if you have questions. The slides are up at that bit.ly link if you wanted to grab them. There's my social over there. That's on specifically Twitter or X now, but I'm also pretty much the only Arthur DOLER on the internet. So if you just Google Arthur DOLER, you can find me. So again, thank you very much for listening.